The Gnostics were only one of several groups which attempted to reconcile pagan and Christian doctrines during the first 5 centuries. These groups insisted that there was nothing essentially new in the Christian dispensation. The Syrian cult was merely a reformation of long-existing institutions, a new interpretation of doctrines sanctified by the veneration of countless nations and peoples of the past. In fact, even the Christians themselves did not realize that they were the custodians of a unique revelation until the growing power of the Church forced this conclusion upon them. Early in this article, we discussed the subject of emanations by which irreconcilable opposites appear to mingle in the middle distances between extremes. The Gnostic cult itself represented an effort to attain this condition of moderation by searching out the Christian elements in pagan philosophy and the pagan elements in Christian philosophy. The Gnostics sought to bind the 2 great dispensations of their time into a unified group dedicated to the perpetuation and dissemination of spiritual wisdom. Gnosticism was a temperate zone between frigid paganism and torrid churchianity. But at that particular time, neither the pagans nor the Christians had a mind for temperance. The 2 great institutions realized that they were locked in a battle to the death. Christianity was certainly the aggressor, and there is very little evidence that paganism was essentially intolerant. After all, there were 100 pagan institutions of spiritual and intellectual culture. These were not necessarily in mutual agreement, but they had dwelt together in comparative peace for thousands of years. The Romans summed up the situation rather well. The citizen may worship at any shrine or temple that pleases his fancy. He may accept the cults of Egypt, favor the Magian religion of Persia, or pay homage to the Greek divinities. He may worship in all temples or in none, but regardless of the definitions of his faith, he must pay his taxes. Gnostic intaglios bearing the form of Abraxas are called variously Abraxoids, Abraxaster gems, and Abraxas gems. According to Dr. J. Bellarmine, the Egyptian Gnostics of the first 3 centuries held the figure of Abraxas in high esteem. They used to symbolize both teacher and teaching as the subject and object of their transcendental researches and mystical speculations. The signets were tokens and path symbols among the initiates of the fraternity, by which they recognized each other and gained admission to their assemblies. The Abraxoid was also an amulet against evil and a talisman of power. It further served the practical purpose of a seal which could be affixed to documents. Most Abraxoids are crudely carved. The cutting appears to consist of a variety of notches and was done with a small coarse wheel. The materials were selected for their magical properties and included jasper, chalcedony, fibrous hematite, and other substances of no great value. Fine Abraxoids in crystal originated outside of the sect itself and were used by astrologers and magicians. Many Gnostic gems bear figures of Greek or Egyptian divinities and magical inscriptions. The form bearing only the rooster-headed deity is most rare, and only a few examples are known to be in private collection. Perhaps the pagans were temperate with a slight tendency towards the chilly side. Their religions were scientific, philosophic, and aesthetic. They discussed God reasonably rather than impulsively, and they approached the problem of living as a serious business to be undertaken scientifically. There is also the much discussed subject of pagan morals. In the long perspective of the ages, there appears to be very little essential difference between ancient and modern delinquency. The old Greeks and Romans and their Egyptian and Chaldean cousins were pious in their pronouncements and somewhat inadequate in the personal application of their impersonal convictions. As one writer expressed it, it is a little difficult to distinguish clearly between Christian and pagan vice. All men in all times, under all conditions, and in all places have found it difficult to be virtuous in the presence of intensive temptation. It has been suggested that Christianity was a spontaneous emergence of a personal nobility, a powerful revulsion against the indescribable and utterly detestable private and public corruption of the pagan world. It seems to me that there is a hint of bias in this perspective. While the early church was gathering its strength for mighty works, paganism also was producing examples of high-mindedness and fineness of character equal to anything that the Christian could advance by way of comparison. From the period 500 BC to 500 AD, civilization received its priceless legacy of religious foundations, philosophical doctrines, scientific institutions, artistic and literary monuments, and its enduring codes of laws, statutes, and regulations of human conduct. From medicine to astronomy, from architecture to poetry, from agriculture to ethics, human talents and abilities were being wisely directed toward what Lord Bacon describes as reasonable ends. During this period, the modern concept of democracy unfolded, universal suffrage was advocated by the Roman Empire, and universal legitimacy was decreed. A Roman lady of the 2nd century had more legal standing than a modern woman living in the state of New York in the 19th or early 20th century. Politicians have always been a seedy lot, but Roman law was essentially sound and was enforced with a reasonable degree of efficiency. Most of the progress attained in the 1,000 years aforementioned was accomplished by pagan men and women. Hippocrates, the father of medicine, was a pagan. So likewise was Ptolemy, the father of geography. The multiplication table was given to us by a pagan, and the first Christian hymn was pagan music with new words. In the 4 centuries directly preceding the Christian era, the pagan world produced nearly 600 immortal leaders of human thought, human industry, and human achievement. Without these men, modern civilization would not exist. How many outstanding leaders of equal or approximate ability were produced in the first 4 centuries of a Christian-dominated Mediterranean civilization? We leave the reader to ponder this issue and discover, if he can, any such array of intellect outside of a circle of theological controversialists whose contributions were completely sterile. It is a little difficult to imagine that men of the caliber of Plato, Euclid, Hippocrates, Cicero, Seneca, and Marcus Aurelius could have been the products of a religious or moral condition as corrupt as the Christian fathers would have us believe. If like begets like, greatness must arise from greatness. The wisdom of the individual reveals the essential wisdom of his time and place. The contemporaries of Cato the Elder may not all have shared the largeness of his mind, but the materials necessary to create that largeness must have been available and readily accessible to such as were by nature inclined to largeness. Even in our own times, all men do not take advantage of the intellectual and spiritual opportunities which civilization offers, but it would be unkind and unfair to deny the existence of truth and wisdom. We have no intention of belittling the essential principles of the Christian dispensation, but we are inclined to agree with Muhammad that the ante-Nicene Church Fathers went to work systematically to organize a theological system so narrow and so ridden with intolerances that Jesus himself could not have been a member of his own church. Had Jesus been born again in 350 AD, he would have been pronounced a heretic and probably crucified a second time for merely repeating the words attributed to him in the Gospels.